The biggest lesson that I've learned is that actually technology is the easy part. The hardest part is people change. It needs to happen from top bottom, which is the strongest one, but it also needs to happen bottom up. Everything around you is data, and then you can start operating with it, and sometimes somehow almost breaking the rules, or maybe just taking it to your advantage. I personally think that at some point some company will appear whose marketing strategy is free of AI, just to separate themselves from everyone else.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Project Flux podcast. We are delighted to have Cristina Sanchez with us. Cristina is a BIM manager and digital engineer at LendLease, and I've had the pleasure of sharing the stage with Cristina a couple of times and met her at the last hackathon, which we covered about 6 months back, the one at Rolls-Royce. So I've always said to people, if you meet me twice, you're going to get an invite to the podcast. So it's obligatory, Cristina, for you to now come on the podcast. But we are really, really glad to have you here. So thank you so much for giving up some of your time to come talk to us.
Thanks so much. I'm honored to be here.
Excellent. So let's start with a little bit about you, because if you look down your LinkedIn, you've done an awful lot in your career, and it spans a lot of different elements: architecture, digital engineering, data analytics. So what kind of sparked this transition from your traditional architecture practice into this digital and data driven side of construction?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So I chose architecture. Part of it was because it was hard for me to decide between something creative, which I like crafting and all these things, and something technical, because, I was good at maths and physics, so why not? And the construction ran in my family. But then I always had this nerd side of trying to find the best way to do things. I remember as a kid playing with this toy computer that had a function that was programming in BASIC. So there was this part of it that was always there. And working as an architect, when I learned about BIM, I also played The Sims. So there's always the gaming part that stays throughout. Playing The Sims, and later when I discovered Revit, I'm like, this is the way to go. So why do we draw lines? We need to work in a way that the computer understands. And the next step of that was when I had the chance to take this data apprenticeship. It's all about working in a smarter way. So first step was BIM, next step was data, and they all work together. So who knows where I will be next? But I keep my options open.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're doing the data apprenticeship, which we've talked about a lot. Both myself and Yoshi have done that as well. And it's a wonderful kind of start, isn't it, to kind of introduce yourself to the world of data analytics. How you what's the kind of sort of the biggest takeaway you've got from it so far? I know you haven't completed it, but if there's one thing you could sort of describe to the listeners as the biggest kind of advantage of doing that course, what would you say it was?
So I like to explain it as, in the Matrix, when Neo takes the red pill and then suddenly everything around it becomes a matrix. You see the numbers falling. So it's a little bit like that. When you do this apprenticeship, you discover that everything around you is data, and then you can start operating with it, and sometimes somehow almost breaking the rules, or maybe just taking it to your advantage. So I think that's the best thing. You also find all of the inefficiencies, so all of the things that people assume that just with a click of a button everything should work, and it doesn't. So you discover both sides, the one that is amazing and the one that could be amazing but actually is not.
Yeah, I love the whole matrix analogy, because it is true. I call it also the light bulb moment, right? And everyone's got a different light bulb moment when it kind of, they understand that this is going to change their whole paradigm about how they look at projects. But can you give us like maybe one example of where that's impacted you directly in your work?
Yeah. So in my work, it's a tricky one, because BIM, it's actually a database, but it's really hard to connect to it. So sometimes insights come not directly from BIM, but from the platforms that are around it. So I remember doing a data science project about crossing site ratios with incident ratios, and finding some things that, like, for example, the ratio of incidents is higher on Mondays and January. So there's a reason why everybody hates Mondays and January. So sometimes you realize that some of the intuitive thoughts actually have a fundament, and sometimes it's the other way around. But it's great to have data to actually check if those thoughts are valid or not.
Yeah. I mean, not that we really needed data to tell us that we all hate Monday mornings, but still, it's good to. It would be really weird if the data said something different and we're all walking around in this alternate reality that in everyone else's world, Monday mornings are fantastic things. We're
Yeah,
not
fair
there
enough.
yet.
I quite like actually, Christina, when you mentioned, because I know James said that, being on the apprenticeship and liking it to the Matrix. But one thing that I've just latched onto is when you mentioned The Sims, because The Sims for me is a very experimental environment and it adds that level of creativity. And from what you've mentioned, it sounds like you're quite experimental with a lot of these things. So within the sphere of AI, in and outside of work, how have you been able to experiment with it? What things have you tried?
Yeah. So I actually the skills from the apprenticeship were quite handy. Basically, the coding plus the
Hmm.
being able to enhance it with AI, because just from what I code myself was quite limited. But then having AI gives some tools. So one of the things that I was testing was to use the generative AIs, the engine that we have available to us in LendLease is currently Google Vertex, so similar to Gemini. And I was playing with it, getting access to some of the knowledge base that we currently have. If you guys know from construction, there's a lot of lessons learned exercise where everybody gathers and say, okay, this is what went wrong, this is what we do next better. And that is all nice and great, but the output for that, in best case, is a document, PDF or a Word, if there's anything. So it's really hard to use those insights in the next project for people who have not been present, who don't know about this
So
document.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was experimenting with using AI to structure that data. So to read through the document and using a certain prompt, generate actions that then can be fed into a platform like, for example, ACC issues, and can be automatically delivered to people who need it because they are starting new projects. So that was one of the cases I was experimenting with. And then there's a lot that you can use in terms of synthesize commercial issues to get the same kind of application of actually delivering it to the places it needs to be.
Yeah, and you talk about BIM. BIM is a big database, and I get a lot of pushback from people when I talk about AI in terms of but the AI is only as good as the data, and the two have to be kind of taken together. And I think you've said that it doesn't matter who wins the AI war. If you want to still be standing, you need sharp data, which is true. But do you think things are moving on from that at all? Do you think the data is still king, or do you actually think that the way that the AI is moving, that things like sort of fake data, I can't remember what you
Synthetic
call
data.
it now, synthetic data, got a brain fart there. Do you think that's going to make this requirement for sharp data diminish, or do you think we will always need good data on a project to get some good outputs?
I personally think that to get the best output, you need the data that is more suitable to you, because how the data is only as good as relevant it is, and sometimes generic data from pre-trained model may be okay, sometimes publicly available data may be okay, but you will only get the optimal results for your particular case if you have your particular data that is relevant to the case that you need. So yeah, definitely things will be easier for those who don't have the right data, because there will be more publicly available, but the winners will be the ones that can actually leverage the one that they have.
Yeah, and with BIM, I mean, BIM has been around for quite some time now, and we had a few BIM experts on the show. We had Professor Sarah Davidson a few months ago, and we asked her the same questions. I'm going to ask you the same. With artificial intelligence getting smarter and smarter all the time, how do you think that's going to impact BIM in terms of usability and adoption? Is it going to help, or are we going to have the same issues as we have at the moment with adoption?
Yeah, so I do believe it's going to help greatly, but maybe I'm not sure if it's going to meet the expectations that some people have, because the way the data works in a BIM model is very different to how it is in text, because text is single dimension, images are 2 dimensions, BIM model is 3D plus all of the other dimensions of the properties plus the interfaces that sometimes don't even live in the model. So it's incredibly complex. So I think people are going to expect that you push a button or you get a prompt and then the generative AI delivers the whole building. And it's going to be really tricky. And that process is probably going to be more achieved towards parametric models, parametric algorithms, rather than generative. But there's definitely progress in there. It's a massive problem that can be broken down into smaller problems. And it's the resolution of these smaller pieces through custom AI solutions, which then can compound to actually make it better. So I definitely think that there's an opportunity there, but there's more work than some people realize to make it happen.
Yeah, because you've got to be careful, haven't you? If you go, you see all the softwares out there now with the promises of generative design and, get a whole design in the click of a button. And they're very compelling. And I'm sure at some point in the future we will get there. But as you say, it's incredibly complex and it's not that simple. So you think that future is possible, but a while away, or you just don't think it's possible at all with the way that we currently do things?
I think it will depend on how we simplify the projects, because at the moment the number of variations is humongous. But if we productize the design in a way that, for example, if you think of the 70s prefab, there's a certain design that gets iterated. If there's any way that a certain design is polished and then it can be put into the machine and then deliver the whole thing. So there will probably be a stream of more limited projects that will be more accessible to everyone. But then the proper complex projects, they will still require human intervention for quite a long time.
And I find that quite interesting, actually, because you mentioned, there's added dimensions into BIM. And the one thing that makes me think visually in my head is one concern that people have about AI, especially within construction, is the notion of hallucinations. So it's like, if you were to have AI hallucinations within the BIM models or some of these outputs which have, extra dimensions, what might that look like? But it's quite interesting. But so, Christina, you've worked with major firms in architecture and with LendLease, for instance. What's the biggest lesson you've learned about how technology might reshape the built environment now and then within the next 5 years?
The biggest lesson that I've learned is that actually technology is the easy part. The hardest part is people change. So there's people's process and technology. Technology, yeah, it's fine, you can sort it. Process is a little bit harder, but then cultural change in people, especially in a large organization, it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
Because it needs to happen in both directions. It needs to happen from top bottom, which is the strongest one, but it also needs to happen bottom up.
Yes.
Which is the way it often starts with nerdy people like me who gather together and start playing with things, but they need the top-down support to actually make it widespread. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but I hope
it's quite a profound interplay as well, because if you people saying that you have to have top down as well as bottoms up adoption of these technologies, but then equally, because some of these AI technologies have risks associated with them, there is the concern that we shouldn't be bringing shadow AI, right? You shouldn't be bringing AI into the workplace and using what's been set by the company. But sometimes you don't know what's the best AI to use. So if you're experimenting, you're trying different things out, that might be perfect for your use case, but it has to then go through this process of how do we get it procured through the company? How do we then get it through resilience and all these different things? So it's a very profound interplay.
Yeah, I agree. And it's necessary. For example, in LendLease, we have ChatGPT is blocked and DeepSeek is blocked. And we have an internal AI instance that I keep spreading it to everyone. So like, guys, please use that one, because if they don't use that one, what they're going to do is they're going to go to their phone and they're going to use ChatGPT, potentially with data that they shouldn't be giving to ChatGPT. So it's a tricky one. And I agree, this experiment, but it needs ideally to be connected to the global business and supported by it.
Yeah, it's very difficult to the whole shadow IT thing is because if you block things, then you do run the risk of sending people off to the kind of their phone or whatever to use their personal accounts. So you need to offer a credible alternative, because if you don't offer an alternative, you create a vortex, and if you create a vortex, people will just fill that in with whatever they've got. So that's really encouraging that you're doing that, and it's very familiar to the kind of tack that we're taking as well, in terms of giving people a very good option. But sometimes, the internal option is always going to be a couple of steps behind the cutting edge. So it's kind of, you're always walking along that tightrope, aren't you? And it reminds me a bit, in some senses, it's nothing new, because I'm old enough to remember, like, when, internet was just starting to come into workplace, and believe it or not, there were companies that were banning Google, back in the day, and you were banned. You couldn't use your phone. You had to put your phone away at the start of the work. And I think the same thing will happen with this. At the moment, everyone's a bit cautious, but it's unavoidable. It's going to permeate through every part of our life. And I think the other thing is that it's going to be really hard to start distinguishing what has got AI and what hasn't got AI, because AI is just going to be built into your everyday tools, right? It's going to be built into your Copilot. It's going to be built into your, no doubt, into your Revit and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I personally think that at some point, some company will appear whose marketing strategy is free of AI, just to
Yeah, I've
separate
said that as
themselves
well.
from everyone else.
Bringing the human element back. You can see it now. I think it's a few years away, but humans do still kind of always crave this authenticity. And whilst AI is amazing, and we've seen it in other industries, right, where the people going back to vinyl records, for instance, or people sort of going back to turning their phones off, they want to be disconnected from the kind of virtual world. So I can definitely see that happening. I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this as well, Yoshi, right?
Yeah, what I was going to say, yeah, it's kind of it's a battle between connectivity and efficiency, right? Because you would assume that AI makes you a lot more efficient, but we have this innate human desire to be connected. So we're more likely to believe humans, right? Because we can emotionally resonate. And I think but the thing with construction is there's a lot of risk and liability associated with that. So finding the balance is a necessity, but it's so hard to work through and understand what that balance looks like. I think the industry it's going to take time to really catch up with that, and especially because, and this is the other thing that I've thought about is as these models become a lot more advanced and they reason better, they should converge into human behavior, so they should be a bit more like humans. So I'm thinking, then, Christina, do you think that as these AI models, especially within generative AI, become a bit more human in how you communicate with them, do you think that will lessen the barrier of adoption?
Yeah, it will. I mean, it depends on the interfaces it's used. It's not just the way they behave, it's also how they're available. I think I mentioned, James, you may remember the story about my mom and how she was showing me recipes that
Yes.
were AI generated. And I was like, how do you get to use AI? And it's because she found an instance that works through WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
not just how the system communicates, but how it reaches people, how you make it available to the spaces where they normally are.
Yeah, which goes back to that adoption piece. And that's the example I always give to people is, if you're not sure, try it with something that you're very familiar with, like recipes is a really, really good one, or planning a holiday, or whatever it may be, because that's where people can get their light bulb moments. And I know if we had Jeff Woods back on the show, we had a couple of weeks ago, he'd say, well, you're not thinking hard enough because actually you're only getting 20% of the value from that. And that's true. But some people have got to start somewhere, right? Someone has to have an entry point, and then you can build them up, because it's really hard to go from nothing to saying to people, right, you've got to use AI as your thought leader, as he calls it, from 0 to 100. I think sometimes some people, not everyone, but some people need that stepping stone along the way. Let's move on to the kind of the future of architecture and digital engineering, because you're quite involved in talks and you're really out there, and you're a real inspiration, Christina. I've seen you at innovation awards and speaking at hackathons, etc., which is amazing. But because of that, you get to see a lot. So what's the most exciting thing you've seen maybe in the last sort of six to 9 months?
Most exciting thing. So one of the things that may be a bit overlooked, but I think there's a lot of potential in it, which is operations. I remember seeing a system that got all of the data from the BIM model, COBie, etc., and just gave the interface to the user to ask, okay, what's the next thing that I have to maintain in the following 6 months? Because I think that's going to mark the difference of how the information is used. At the moment, BIM, it's mostly used during design and construction phases, and then the model, it's handed over often, but then it's just put in a drawer and nobody touches it ever again.
Such a shame, isn't it?
Yeah,
because that's not the point.
Exactly. So if you have a system interface that actually lets the normal user that doesn't necessarily have a super powerful computer to open the Navisworks file, just use that information for their day-to-day operations, that's going to be a game changer, I believe.
Yeah. And how far away is that available now, or is that something that you're seeing starting to be developed?
It exists. Yeah, so the company is called Operans.
Okay.
It exists. I don't know how widespread they are and how much clients are using it, but yeah, I believe it's got potential.
Oh, we'll check that out, and we'll try and put that in the show notes as well, because people often want to kind of play around with the things that we talk about. So if we'll try and get that in the show notes for folk to have a play around with, because no doubt they'll have some demos and stuff. But that's why I love doing these kind of podcasts as well, because I find out things I didn't know about. So there's a little bit of juicy kind of gossip that I'll be checking out after this for sure. But in terms of like architects, and we've had some great architects on the show. We had Martha from Fosters and Partners a few months ago. Like with all jobs, there's this fear that AI is going to replace architects, while others believe it's just going to kind of enhance their work. Or the old adage that we're hearing more and more of, it won't be AI that replaces you, it will be the person that knows how to use AI that will replace you. What's your take on this one?
So I work as an architect for a few years, and there's many tasks that I was looking forward for the AI to replace. There's an awful lot of repetitive stuff that it would be better done by the AI, to be honest. And whether that limits the amount of jobs are available to architects, well, I don't know, maybe, but it will hopefully make the architect's job nicer, because then they can actually focus on the things that are important on creating nice spaces of people, instead of creating repetitive details of dry lining, for example, or door shapes or something
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Well,
And that's what I think as well. I think for the architects, they should be the ones most embracing this, because they're the creative ones who, like you say, don't really want to be doing that kind of grunt stuff and detailing and stuff. They want to be doing the creative stuff. So, but it's strange. I actually find the most resistance from architects because they see AI as a threat to their creativity somehow. Sorry, Yoshi, you were going to cut in there, I think.
yeah, so I'm not an architect, but one tool that I've seen a few versions of this specific use case recently, and it's text to CAD. And the outputs look really interesting. You're seeing these 3D assets being built. Now, the assets that are being built are quite basic in structure, typical squares, rectangles, and more similar basic builds. But my question for you, Christina, is if this sort of AI technology is reliable, and valid and accurate, do you think that would be a game changer within architecture?
So are we saying these tools that you add a prompt and then it creates the generative script to
Yeah.
actually model something? Definitely. I haven't used it myself, so I don't know how much it works. It would be a matter of seeing the actual progress, but it would definitely help in the earlier stages of prototyping and getting some of
So
this.
what would you look for then? So if you were to use that tool and you had the output, what would you look for that you think, okay, this is a good tool?
So reliability, as you mentioned, so that's the main thing, that it actually generates something that complies with what you're looking for. And then in terms of the actual output, I recently saw one of these parametric tools where you could adjust and create lines and it would create the whole building. And on one hand, I was really excited of that is there. On the other hand, I was terrified because what I was looking was horrible. So it's like, take it with a pinch of salt. If it's for a feasibility study, then start there, get the numbers. Now you know what you can fit in there, and then you may want to start on a blank sheet because you don't want the whole world populated by designs that have been created that way. And that's where the human factor still comes in.
I love that. See, that's the being creative and saying combining both the AI with the human intuition. And there's ways to do that. So I say to people, it's not necessarily an either or. It's actually both. You can still keep the human intuition and use AI for some of that grunt stuff. Or, especially for creative industries, I'm finding a lot of people using it to help with kind of what I call writer's block, whether you're a graphic designer or an architect. Sometimes you've got to start with a blank sheet of paper, right? And sometimes it's really hard to go from a blank sheet of paper to an idea. And sometimes AI can give you the kickstart to go from, okay, I've got an idea now. And I think that's really powerful. People are underestimating the power of that. Cool. We're getting towards sort of the end of the chat. It's been absolutely fascinating, as I knew it would be. We kind of have a section at the end where we get some kind of insight from you. And we always try and ask our guests, because we're a big fan of books and, or podcasts or other kind of media, because we think it's so important to immerse yourself in this. Can we ask you, what's one book or podcast or YouTube video, whatever you like, that's really kind of influenced you, whether this year or in your career?
So I like to mention one which is The Dispossessed by Ursula. I cannot remember her surname, but it's one of the classics. And it's really interesting because it's about an anarchist utopia. And let me clarify, there's a moment where the anarchist land is the moon.
It's a novel, is it? This
yes,
is a novel.
Okay. Yeah, it is. It's like science fiction. And the anarchist goes to the planet, and they're seeing this exhibition where there's an exhibition about a tyrant queen.
Okay.
And then the capitalist character says, well, actually, you're complaining about this tyrant that you guys don't have, but this tyrant in your society lives inside your head because you have all of this austerity and all of these rules that you impose on yourselves. It's better to have this queen in a palace where you can just kick her out. And then this character said, well, it's in my head where it should be. So it made me think a lot that actually the real freedom comes from imposing your own constraints and imposing rules to yourself that are actually harder than the walls puts on you.
Yeah, extremely good advice. I mean, it reminds me of the story from Viktor Frankl, who was someone who was in the death camps in the Holocaust, and he had a very similar story about, you know, they can take away everything from you except for the way that you kind of perceive it and the way you deal with it mentally. So really powerful stuff there. So can you give us the name of that novel again? Because again, we'll make sure we put it in the show
It's
notes.
The Dispossessed, and I will
Cool.
find
The Dispossessed. Awesome. Another question for you. If you weren't working in digital construction, which I couldn't imagine for a minute because you're so prolific in what you do, what completely different career would you be doing?
I'm not sure how completely different, but I would have probably gone somewhere along either maths or computer science or something in between. So yeah, maybe an AI engineer by now, which somehow I seem to be converging, but not in that much in depth.
Isn't it funny how things like that happen? Because similarly to you, you know, when I was at university, I did a dissertation on digital construction, and then I went into practice, and then it's kind of converged back. So sometimes you just got to go around these kind of funny routes to get to where you're going.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I was talking about it earlier this week, that if I had the chance, would I have studied architecture again? Probably yes, because whatever you do, even if it's not the path that you would have thought, it equips you with different tools. So as architects, as you guys probably know, it gives us tools to break down a problem and create a solution that maybe you don't get with other type of studies. So yeah, it works at the end.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in not kind of thinking what if, because what got you here is Steve Jobs said it, didn't he, that you can only kind of join the dots afterwards when you look back and go, okay, that's why I've done that. And now you're doing the data apprenticeship, for instance, you know, taking you down a different path yet again. So it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, every choice you've made takes you in the past, has taken you to where you are today.
Exactly.
So it's
I agree with that.
Very true.
Cool. So finally, one last question before we wrap up. If you could give one piece of advice to young people listening to this podcast, people maybe thinking about getting into the industry or thinking about getting into dabbling with AI, what would it be?
My first thought would be to ask, are you sure?
What are you letting yourself in for?
Yeah, but not really. So my piece of advice would be to stay updated, because sometimes, yeah, you're doing a degree, you're studying a lot, and then you're tempted to just close the books and not learn anything else and just focus on working. But I think it's vital, and now more than ever, to stay updated with everything that goes on, to read the news, to go to forums, to speak to people, to understand what's the next thing, because you may find something that may be your next step. Some people start planning with their careers 5 to 10 years. It's really hard to do that. I'm probably not the best choice to do a 10 years career plan now, because there may be something coming up in the next couple of years that completely changes your career, as it's happened to me. So yeah, my advice is stay updated, stay connected to the news, connected to people, because who knows where you're going to end up next.
Yeah. And now more than ever, in terms of careers, who knows where things are going to be in 5 years' time. And in terms of the updating, you've raised some good points there, reading, listening to podcasts, all those things. Subscribing to the Project Flux newsletter, right, Yoshi? That's your first action if you're thinking about what to do. Get to our newsletter, which will be in the show notes. But I also think there's a fundamental shift starting to happen in that, you know, the schooling system, the education system really has been set up for a world that's no longer going to exist. What do you think about, do you think the whole kind of education system needs a real kind of rethink? Because I'm really worried, like for my kids, for instance, I'm really worried about whether the skills that they've learned over the last however many years at school is really going to equip them for what's happening.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's oftentimes what they call the hidden curriculum, which is finding how people work and how to go around hurdles and requirements. It's often more helpful than the actual curriculum. And the whole thing needs a rethink. One of the points that I discovered when I came here to the UK and I realized what top universities do compared to what other universities in the world do, and which is around the networkings and all the groups that happen outside of the curriculum, where you meet people that may change your career because you build something with them and you learn something from them. So I think that education still has a key place, and maybe not so much in the content, but in how it brings people together to build things together. So I personally think that it needs to focus around that, around equipping people with finding their way around tools, finding their way around a changing world, and then bringing them together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this goes back to what we said near the beginning of the chat around it's almost gone full circle, and it's all about the human interactions. And that's the skills that I don't think they learn enough at school at the moment. But I'm sure, things will emerge over the next few years where the education system will have to react to that in some way, shape or form. Christina, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's really great to talk to you. Hopefully I'll see you at the hackathon, maybe. Are you at the hackathon?
Yes, I will be there.
Fantastic. So it won't be too long till I see you again. And we do hope that you'll come back onto the show, because things are moving so fast. We like to get our guests to come back on with updates of what they're up to.
Well, if you've ever seen James 4 times, you asked you to come on the podcast twice.
So it's every 2 times there's a visit. Okay.
Yeah, you just have to avoid me. Just run. If you see me, run.
It's all right. I can take it.
But thank you so much, Christina. And we will see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.